Okay, so we know that there is global warming, and so in 2007, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, made a statement in their report that global warming is due to human activities. So another term that scientists often use is the anthropogenic. Okay, so these are based on human activities. From the different models that they use, they project about a 5 degrees Celsius increase over the next 100 years. That is if no action is being taken, but even with action being taken within the next 10 years, the temperatures will still increase to about 2 to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. Sea level rise is also projected over the next 100 years, okay, about 20 cm. So the main increase is due to greenhouse gases. So I've kept focusing on CO2 as a greenhouse gas, but of course we know there are other types of greenhouse gases, methane and CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. Okay. However, for these gases, they usually measure it in terms of global warming potential, GWP, global warming potential. So it's just the the detrimental effects of the gas versus the amount of the gas being released. So among all these greenhouse gases, the one with the highest GWP is CO2. Okay, so CO2 has increased significantly, uh, and based on industrialization, deforestation, etc. So carbon footprint. So how much carbon are we using per capita? So now we are using about 5 times what the Earth can sustain, which is which basically means the way we are living is not sustainable. Something has to give. Okay? We cannot continue like this. Basically, if we continue like this, we won't be able to continue. Okay? So one of the concern is also population. Okay? Overpopulation brings about other problems, food scarcity, water scarcity, etc. Okay? So this one we've covered. So this graph shows the temperature increase over the last 150 years. So significant increase with industrialization, and as you can see, the increase is has been temperatures have been increasing over the last 100 years. Okay. So we also have melting of ice and glaciers. This is from the North Pole. This is the Arctic Ocean. Here is I forgot to mention that there is another landmass here that has a lot of ice, and that's Greenland. Okay, so the melting of ice here will also cause a potential problem. So this is the ice cover. So in September 1979, September is summer. Okay, so you can see that it is still landlocked. Okay, ships cannot traverse. However, 2007, you can see that the ice cover has decreased tremendously, and then recently, the last 2 years, ships are able to uh, cross the Arctic Ocean. So these are pictures, comparative pictures that shows the loss of glacier and the loss of glacier in different habitats, loss of ice and snow on the mountains, We also have rising sea levels, drought, okay, loss of habitat. So carbon taxation was one of the uh, proposals during the Kyoto Convention, where there's carbon trading between nations. So if you are underutilizing your carbon quota, which means if you are still developing, you don't have many industries, and you have low population, so you are basically not fully utilizing your carbon quota, then you can sell your quota to the other countries that are overproducing of CO2, overproducing CO2. So that was a system that was proposed, but it was not really implemented yet. Some countries decided to do that, but not really catching on yet. Okay, so carbon trading and emission trading schemes. Of course, with the hype of CO2, there are suggestions to capture the carbon and store it. Okay, so as a temporary measure to store it deep in the sea or deep underground. Okay, so we have solutions to proposed solutions to global warming, climate change. Okay, so what is the relationship between uh, climate change and the sea? Okay, but before we do that, okay, so this shows the geomorphology structure of a coastline. Okay, so this is the land area, and around the land area you have the continental shelf. This is shallower, but even when you talk about shallow, it's about 100 meters, 100 to 200 meters. Okay, then we have a continental slope and the abyssal plain. Okay, the continental rise here is because of some of the sediments uh, that precipitates down here and gets accumulated here. Okay, so what I want to show you here is the significant amount of area in the sea is abyssal. Okay, between 2000 to 6000 meter depth. The sublittoral or the continental shelf area is only 8%. So although this is only 8%, it is the most productive uh, part of the ocean. Okay, so the most productive is here, but most of the sea is here, abyssal. Okay, so most of the seas are very deep. Okay, so what's the relationship between global warming and oceans? First, you have to understand that uh, the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt. Okay, the concept of this is thermohaline circulation. That means the currents move based on heat and salt density. So basically, uh, the heat, the temperature, and the salt concentration or salinity will influence the density of the seawater. Temperature will also influence the density of the seawater. So these two will combine to derive a density driven current. So the major currents in the oceans in the world move based on density. Okay? So this is the uh, Great Ocean Conveyor Belt. The blue here indicates the current in the deep waters. So when we're talking about deep waters, it's easily 2,000 to 6,000 meter deep. Okay. Then here are the surface currents. Okay, the red ones. So of course, if its surface currents is nearer to the sun, it's warmer, whereas the blue, deep in the oceans, far from the sun, these are cold waters. Okay, so the ocean conveyor belt shows that the major currents move like this, okay, and go up to the North Pole, the Arctic Ocean. Here, when it is here, because the North Pole is colder, the temperature of the waters decreased. And as the temperature of the waters decrease, the density increases and the water starts to sink. Okay, so there is sinking here, or the term that we use is downwelling. Okay, DOWNWELLING, downwelling. So downwelling here occurs here, starts moving to the Antarctic, and then when it reaches the Pacific Ocean here, there's a Bering Sea, there's a shelf here that forms a physical blockage. Okay, and because of that, it is forced up, and this in this area is known as upwelling. So there's downwelling here and upwelling here. So that's basically how the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt uh, moves. Okay. So when the currents move like this, they are also distributing heat, distributing nutrients throughout the Earth. When deep waters come up, okay, upwelling here, when the waters come up, these cold waters contain a lot of nutrients. Okay. So that's why this area here is very famous for fishing, fishing industry. There are lots of fish here, commercial fish catch here. That's why the countries, uh, Alaska, North America, Russia, Japan, are very invested into the fishing industry, okay, because of this uh, productive area here. Okay, so this is the basic diagram of the uh, Great Ocean Conveyor Belt. So as I mentioned, the ice on Greenland here is melting. So this is one of the questions that scientists began to ponder upon. When so much ice is melting on Greenland, the seawater here will be will have less salinity, will have less salt. That means there is a danger that the water here will not be cold enough, will not be dense enough to sink. So if there is no downwelling here, if there's no water sinking here, what will happen to the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt? One of the hypotheses is the belt will stop. So when the belt stops, when the oceans are not moving uh, as usual, the climate, the global climate will change abruptly. And the hypothesis is it will bring about the next ice age, an ice age to recalibrate the oceans. For geomorphology of our coastline, in Malaysia, our coastline are all uh, shallow. So because we are on a shelf, on the Sunda Shelf, okay, Malaysia is located on the Sunda Shelf. And if you remember some of the geomorphological structure at the ocean bottom, you have trench and you have seamount. Okay, so if you remember, the deepest part of the ocean is at the Marianas Trench, that's off Philippines. So the hypothesis that Earth formation is through seafloor spreading. So Earth is always there's always new Earth being formed, and the place where they are formed are active volcanic areas. So there are submarine ridges where new Earth is being formed. So when new Earth is being formed, the seafloor will spread. However, Earth doesn't change in size. Therefore, at another part of the ocean, at the bottom of the ocean, there they have subduction zones where the ocean plate is being pushed under the continental plate. Okay, then this will be remelted as magma. So of course, when you have a lot of physical movements of pushing and compression, this is where you have earthquakes, and also you have this is where you can have the plates rupturing and earthquakes. So the subduction zone is where trench formation is formed. Okay, so some terms to classify the marine environment between pelagic and benthic. So you need to know these terms because it will make it easier for you to understand the paper that you are reading, the journals that you're reading. Okay, so for pelagic is the whole body of seawater versus benthic. Benthic is the sea floor. However, for the pelagic zone, you can divide into neritic waters and oceanic waters. So the neritic waters are the waters over the continental shelf. We do this because the waters here in the neritic waters are much more productive than oceanic waters. Okay, that's why the scientists will categorize them separately so that you can see the difference between productive neritic waters and less productive oceanic waters. So another way of categorizing the waters is based on light, the amount of light that is present. So euphotic means enough light for vision, enough light for plant. Dysphotic is enough light for vision, but not enough for plant. So plants, I'm talking about the photosynthetic organisms, your phytoplankton, your cyanobacteria, your algae. Okay? So you have euphotic, dysphotic, and aphotic. So aphotic sunlight is absent. It's essentially pitch black. It's dark. Okay, usually beyond 1,000 meters. So this is how sometimes you can use light to differentiate the different areas of the sea, okay, based on depth. Okay. We do that because the euphotic zone is generally more productive. There are more biological activities there. So it's easier if you can categorize the euphotic zone, euphotic depth, and then just focus your work on the euphotic zone. So characteristics of the seawater, important characteristics: maximum density at 4 degrees Celsius is a universal solvent. This is important because it is a universal solvent, a lot of nutrients are dissolved in the sea. So these nutrients are available to the organisms living in the sea. Okay. Maximum density of 4 degrees at 4 degrees Celsius is important. That means seawater will not freeze. Okay. It will not uh, freeze throughout the water column. Okay. Because whenever water freezes, when it becomes ice, it's basically fresh water and it floats. So the waters under the ice is still liquid. This is important. That means organisms can still survive and will not be frozen. Okay. Okay. So characteristics of the seawater, you also have uh, gas gases that are dissolved in the sea. So the amount of gas soluble in the sea is dependent upon the salinity and also upon temperature. Okay. Another important characteristic is essentially transparent. Why is this important? Because it has to be transparent. If not, light cannot get to the phytoplankton. Light cannot get to the phototrophs. You also have pressure and currents and tides. Okay. Uh, so if you live near the sea, you will notice that there is high tide, there's low tide. So high tide when the seas come in, low tide when the seas are out. However, there is also spring high tide, spring tides, and neap tides. So spring tides are when the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun work together to make the tides highest and lowest. So spring tides are when the movement of the water is at its extreme, maximum. So during spring tides, when the waters come in, it comes in the highest, and when it subsides, it goes all the way to the furthest away from the land. Okay, so that is spring tide. Neap tide is when the action of the moon and the sun crosses each other out. So the difference between high tide and low tide during the neap tides are minimal. So during neap tides, the maximum water level and the minimum water level are smaller in range. Okay. Other than spring tides and neap tides, there are also different uh, tidal patterns, whether semi-diurnal, diurnal patterns, or mixed tides. So if you have a diurnal tide, you have two high tides and essentially two low tides. If you have a semi-diurnal, okay, you will have two low tides and about three high tides. So it is not so semi-diurnal, two high tides, two low tides. For diurnal, one high and one low. Okay, yeah. So diurnal is one high and one low tide. Semi-diurnal, two high, two low. So within Malaysia itself, we have different uh, tidal regimes. Okay? In West Peninsula Malaysia, it is semi-diurnal. Okay? So waves are caused by winds, and when you talk about wave, there's a crest, throw, height, and wavelength. Important point here is waves do not transport water. Okay, so you see waves, but they are actually not. It is the water currents that move water, not the waves. Okay,